This is the defense of my research paper for HIUS 713. The research paper is called 40 Cents a Day Makes a Prostitute, the Argument for a Living Wage for Working Women in the Progressive Era. So the research questions, and there are multiple research questions, not just one for this paper, that are being addressed by my paper are: what was the argument for a living wage or minimum wage for working women during the Progressive Era? Why was it important? And finally, what is the outcome of the debate? The significance of these questions really come down to what is essentially the thesis and the conclusion of the paper, and that is that the demand for a living wage or a minimum wage that would support the working women at the minimum necessary for health and decency, attempted to address the problems of low pay as well as other issues associated with women's labor. However, it had its many detractors who believed that a living wage or minimum wage for women was not supported or unnecessary. And in the end, the fight for a living wage or a minimum wage would continue to be an uphill battle, even today. The majority of the primary sources that were used for my research were articles from journals from the Progressive Era, as well as some government documents that I found, like some court documents and Department of Labor documents. As for the methodology used for the research, actually began with a different topic of research, but during my research, I was actually inspired by an article by Marilyn Powers, and I began to research this topic. And I used that particular article in this topic. From there, I searched Liberty University's Jerry Falwell Library databases for articles using various key phrases, but I actually struggled a lot to find primary sources. So I went back to my secondary source articles that I found and started to search through their sources. And from there, I went back using their primary sources and was able to find more primary sources and to sort of get a jump start on my own primary source research, as well as finding additional secondary sources. Now, what I found in my research was that the process for establishing a living wage or a minimum wage for working women was a slow one. Many of the employers and even some of the economists of the time argued that the main reason women's wages were low was that immigration had caused an oversupply of unskilled and poorly motivated workers. Reformers argued that the reasons that women's wages were so low was because of immobility within the workplace, lack of skill and education, inexperience, lack of physical strength, intermittent work experience, often due to family commitments, marriage, or pregnancy, and lack of unionization among women, although this was not necessarily true, as women across the country would organize and picket their various companies and industries in turn. It's also noted within my research that as a result of low wages, many women had to resort to second jobs and even to prostitution, hence the title of my paper. I also found that from an economist point of view, these industries that offered low wages did so as a means of maintaining their competitive advantage in the market, and that many of the economists were very critical of this type of competitive advantage because the strategy created a negative externality, since low wage workers would have to draw their subsistence from somewhere else, which implied a cost to society and either increased charity, increased vice, or as a burden upon family members whose incomes uh, were paid a living wage. And since family members who earned a living wage would be obliged to share their incomes with those who did not, the average wage of a multiple earner household could and possibly would fall below what is considered a living wage. This would often diminish the working and learning capacity of all workers, not just women in such circumstances. Therefore, it followed that even workers who were paying a living wage paid a living wage might have to bear part of the burden associated with the employment of workers whose ability or work ethic was impaired by an impoverished standard of living. However, in the end, the fight for the living wage or minimum wage would continue to be an uphill battle. From 1912 and the Minimum Wage Act to the 1930s and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Fair Labor Standards Act, and even to today, people continue to fight for a standard living or minimum wage. The Minimum Wage Act of 1912 was just a compromise, but it was a compromise in which believers in the measure were willing to accept it as marking a great advance. The law established a permanent minimum wage commission with authority to set in motion the machinery of investigation and to give wide publicity to the facts that it ascertained. And in hindsight, we can see that the debate that began early within the progressive era and continued well into the 1940s reflected deep and lasting changes that were taking place and which continue to take place today. Thank you.